The station was buzzing with impatience, the sound of boots tapping against wooden planks, and the low murmur of frustration rising with each passing minute. A train, once the lifeline of the town, stood silent on the tracks, its iron heart stilled, its promise of departure broken. Merchants cursed under their breath, passengers fanned themselves against the merciless heat, and the conductor wrung his hands, helpless in the face of failure. In the middle of the restless crowd stood an old cowboy, weathered by years of dust and silence, his hat pulled low, his presence dismissed as little more than a relic of a time gone by. "You're useless," the younger men sneered, their laughter sharp and cruel. They saw nothing but a shadow of what once might have been, a man too slow, too worn, too old to matter. To them, his calloused hands were nothing but reminders of a past no longer needed in a world now racing on steel tracks and roaring engines. The old ways, they believed, had no place beside progress. Yet progress, for all its might, had ground to a halt, and the very machine they trusted had left them stranded in their arrogance. The cowboy said nothing. He had long since learned that wisdom does not need to defend itself with noise. His eyes, steady as the horizon, studied the broken engine with a quiet focus that went unnoticed by those too eager to mock. Beneath the wrinkles carved by years of sun and sorrow lay a mind sharpened not by books or machines, but by necessity. The land had taught him patience, the trail had taught him resilience, and hardship had taught him to see solutions where others saw only obstacles. Minutes stretched into an hour, and tempers grew hotter than the desert air. The conductor announced delay upon delay, his voice cracking with shame. The crowd groaned, some even cursing the railroad itself. And still, the old cowboy stood silent, his presence almost ghost-like, until his gaze settled on a single loose piece, hidden from eyes too frantic to notice. In that moment, the years of ridicule and dismissal weighed heavy on his shoulders, but so did the certainty that he still had something left to give. Then, without a word, he stepped forward. The crowd scoffed, their mockery loud and bitter, but the cowboy ignored them. With hands steady despite the tremor of age, he knelt by the machine and touched the stubborn metal as though it were an old friend. What happened next would silence every voice, for in mere minutes, the train that had been declared hopeless shuddered, groaned, and roared back to life. The same people who mocked him stood frozen, their disbelief swallowed by awe. And in the rising steam, the old cowboy proved that even the most forgotten soul can carry the power to change everything. The hiss of steam filled the air as the iron beast came back to life, and the mocking voices that had once ridiculed the old cowboy fell into stunned silence. The massive wheels, frozen for what felt like an eternity, shuddered and groaned before turning again under his steady hands. For a moment, no one moved. The passengers who had cursed the delay stood in disbelief, their complaints swallowed by the thunderous rhythm of an engine restored. The old cowboy, hat pulled low over his brow, simply dusted his hands and stepped back, as if fixing what others had deemed impossible was nothing more than a natural task. But beneath his silence was a history no one there cared to know. This man had once been more than just a figure leaning against wooden posts in forgotten towns. He had lived through fires, storms, and battles where ingenuity was the only weapon between survival and death. He had mended broken wagons in the wilderness, patched saddles under lightning storms, and repaired rifles in the dead of night when enemies were near. Machines were no stranger to him. They were puzzles, and survival had made him a master of solving them. Yet, because his face bore the lines of age and his steps were slower than the young, the crowd had dismissed him as useless. As the engine roared stronger, a hush settled over the people who had mocked him only minutes before. Their pride burned hotter than the desert sun, for they realized that the very man they had laughed at now stood as the reason their journey could continue. The conductor, red-faced with shame, could not meet the cowboy's eyes. He had joined in the chorus of ridicule, forgetting that respect is not owed to youth or appearance, but to experience. And in that moment, the weight of his own arrogance pressed heavier than any burden he had carried before. The old cowboy did not bask in their silence, nor did he seek applause. He had no hunger for recognition, no need for praise. He only knew that when something is broken, you fix it, and when people are in need, you step forward. That had always been the law of the frontier, not written on paper, but carved into the lives of those who survived it. To him, it was not about proving anyone wrong. It was about doing what was right. Yet the truth lingered in the air. He had proven them all wrong, and they knew it. As the train whistled and prepared to move, the passengers exchanged uneasy glances. They had mocked a man whose silence hid more strength than their words could ever carry. The boy who had laughed the loudest looked down at his boots, ashamed. A woman whispered softly to her child, "Never judge a man by his silence." And though the old cowboy said nothing, his actions had already spoken louder than any voice in that station. The journey resumed, the train rolling across the endless plains, but the atmosphere inside the cars had shifted. Where there had been impatience and arrogance, there was now a heavy quiet, broken only by the clatter of wheels on steel. Passengers stole glances at the cowboy, some with shame, others with curiosity. He sat alone, his weathered hat tilted forward, as if the moment outside had never happened. But in the silence, thoughts churned. They wondered who he was, what stories his silence concealed, and how many times before he had stepped forward when others doubted him. The younger men who had mocked him most struggled with their pride. To admit they had been wrong was harder than drawing a gun in a duel. They whispered among themselves, trying to excuse their laughter, convincing one another that it had only been a joke. Yet, deep down, they knew the truth. Their arrogance had blinded them, and the man they dismissed as useless had shown more skill and courage than any of them possessed. It was a bitter lesson, one the frontier had a way of teaching again and again. Children, however, looked at him differently. Their eyes, untainted by pride, saw not a relic but a hero. They whispered to each other, imagining the adventures he must have lived, the dangers he must have faced. To them, he was not just an old cowboy, but a living story, one they longed to hear. And though he did not speak, his silence became an invitation to wonder, a reminder that the greatest tales are not always shouted. They are carried quietly in the hearts of those who live them. The conductor finally approached, hat in hand, his voice low and filled with regret. He stammered out an apology, one that felt too small compared to the weight of the insult he had given. The old cowboy simply nodded, his expression unreadable. He did not need apologies, nor did he hold grudges. The frontier had taught him long ago that bitterness only poisons the soul. But the conductor's shame burned deeply, for he realized that in his arrogance, he had disrespected not only a man, but the very wisdom that kept the West alive. As the train pressed on through the wild expanse, the passengers realized that what had happened was more than the fixing of a machine. It was a lesson carved into their journey, a truth they would carry long after they reached their destination. That wisdom does not fade with age, and silence often hides a strength the world forgets until it is needed most. And in the quiet figure of the old cowboy, they saw not uselessness, but the living proof that even the most overlooked soul can change the course of everything in a single moment. The train rolled steadily across the barren plains, but the silence inside its cars weighed heavier than the dust outside. Every passenger felt the echo of their earlier mockery, like a stone pressing against the chest. Some tried to pretend nothing had happened, burying their shame beneath polite chatter, but their eyes betrayed them. They stole fleeting glances at the old cowboy, seated quietly by the window, his face calm, as if the roar of the engine he had revived meant nothing at all. To them, it was a miracle. To him, it was simply another task completed. The boy who had mocked him the loudest shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His laughter, once so sharp, now seemed hollow in memory. He wanted to approach the cowboy, to mutter an apology, but pride locked his words inside. Instead, he studied the man's weathered hands, rough and scarred from years of labor. Those hands had fixed what no one else could, and the boy realized that wisdom was written into those calluses, a language he had never cared to read. For the first time, he envied the strength that came not from youth but from survival. The women whispered among themselves, voices hushed with a mixture of shame and curiosity. He knew exactly what to do, one said softly, as if the machine spoke to him. Another nodded, recalling how he had moved with such certainty, wasting no motion, no time. It dawned on them that perhaps the old cowboy had lived through more battles than any of them could imagine. Only his battlefield was not made of trains and engines, but of wilderness, storms, and endless miles of road where life or death hinged on quick thinking. The conductor, unable to let go of his guilt, found himself glancing toward the cowboy again and again. He remembered his own words, sharp and dismissive, and each time he recalled them, his face burned with humiliation. It was not just that he had been wrong. It was that he had allowed others to join in the cruelty, turning one man into the object of their laughter. Now, with every turn of the wheels, that laughter sounded like betrayal in his ears. He wondered if respect, once broken, could ever be restored. Yet through it all, the cowboy remained silent. He did not gloat, did not sneer, did not remind them of their mistake. His silence was his greatest lesson, louder than any words he might have spoken. In that silence, the passengers began to see the truth, that real strength is not found in the roar of pride, but in the quiet dignity of a man who knows who he is, even when the world refuses to see it. Night fell across the plains, and the train became a moving lantern cutting through the darkness. The passengers tried to sleep, but many lay restless, their minds replaying the moment when the cowboy had knelt by the engine and brought it back to life. The younger men especially felt the sting of shame. Their words, "You're useless," echoed in their memories like a cruel refrain. They began to realize that arrogance is often born from ignorance, and ignorance from fear. They had mocked what they did not understand, and in doing so, revealed more about themselves than about the man they ridiculed. The boy, unable to rest, finally rose from his seat and walked down the narrow aisle toward the cowboy. His voice trembled as he spoke. "Sir, I was wrong." The cowboy lifted his gaze, eyes steady and kind despite the years carved into them. He did not scold, nor did he accept the apology with pride. He simply tipped his hat and said, "You'll learn. We all do." Those words struck deeper than any rebuke, for they carried both truth and grace. The boy returned to his seat, his heart heavy yet lighter, knowing he had been forgiven without judgment. Others followed in their own ways. A woman offered him a blanket, though he declined politely. Another placed a small piece of bread on the table near him, a gesture of quiet gratitude. Even the conductor, swallowing his pride, approached once more and asked softly if the cowboy would accept his thanks. The old man gave a slight nod, nothing more, but in that simple gesture, the weight of shame lifted, and the train car seemed to breathe easier. The passengers began to speak less of the delay and more of the lesson. They realized how easily the world casts aside the old, the quiet, the forgotten, without ever asking what wisdom might lie hidden beneath the surface. They saw how quickly they had joined in cruelty, and how one man's steady hands had exposed their own weakness. It was humbling, and humbling truths have a way of burning deeper than wounds. As the train pressed forward into the night, the cowboy leaned back in his seat, eyes closing against the sway of the car. He did not need their gratitude. He had not acted for recognition. But in their whispers, he heard something change. Respect had been born, not from power or wealth, but from humility and quiet strength. And in the darkness, a lesson settled into every heart, that sometimes the most overlooked man can carry the greatest light. By morning, the train slowed as it approached a small outpost town. The passengers stretched their legs, eager to escape the cramped cars, yet their eyes lingered on the old cowboy. Something about him had shifted, not in himself, but in the way they now saw him. Where before they had dismissed him as a relic, now they recognized a man whose silence concealed a lifetime of survival, a man who had carried the West on his shoulders long before they were born. The dusty streets of the town seemed almost to bow to his presence as he stepped off the train, his boots striking the wooden platform with quiet authority. The children, curious and unburdened by the pride that chained the adults, followed him with wide eyes. "Mister, how did you know what to do?" one asked, his voice trembling between awe and fear. The cowboy paused, then knelt so that his weathered face was level with the boy's. "When you spent a life fixing what's broken," he said softly, "you learn to listen, not with your ears, but with your hands and your heart." The children absorbed his words as if they were gold, for they sensed that in his simplicity lay truths too big for books. Inside the saloon, men who had once mocked him at the station now lowered their eyes as he entered. The clatter of glasses quieted, replaced by the uneasy weight of respect. He ordered nothing but water, took his seat in the corner, and said not a word. Yet his silence commanded the room more than any gun ever could. The frontier had always worshipped noise, loud laughter, loud threats, loud boasts. But here was proof that silence, when earned, could humble even the proudest. Whispers of the train incident had already reached the town. By noon, stories grew, each retelling painting him larger than life. Some said he had fixed the machine with a single touch. Others swore he spoke to it like an old friend. Though the cowboy cared nothing for such tales, he knew how the West worked. Legends grew not from truth alone, but from the way truth lit the imaginations of those desperate for heroes. And if his story brought hope, he would not deny it. Still, as he sat in the corner of that saloon, he felt the weight of years pressing down. The respect now given was a far cry from the mockery he had endured, but he knew how quickly crowds could turn. He had seen the West chew up men faster than storms devoured crops. The question that haunted him was not whether they respected him now, but whether they would remember the lesson tomorrow. For he knew better than most. Men often forget wisdom when pride rises again. As the train prepared to leave the outpost, the cowboy lingered near the tracks, watching the smoke coil into the pale sky. The conductor approached once more, this time with a different tone, not of apology, but of curiosity. "Why didn't you tell us you knew what to do?" he asked. The cowboy's eyes narrowed against the sunlight as he answered, "Because wisdom doesn't need to announce itself. It waits for the right moment to be heard." Those words, spoken with the calm certainty of a man who had lived them, lingered in the conductor's mind long after. Back aboard the train, the atmosphere had transformed. Where there had once been ridicule, there was now deference. Passengers no longer spoke of him as a burden, but as the quiet guardian of their journey. They offered him food, a better seat, even conversation, though he declined most of it with a simple nod. It wasn't comfort he sought, nor recognition, only the silence of the plains and the rhythm of steel carrying him onward. The younger men, still ashamed, began to whisper among themselves not with scorn, but with respect. "He fixed it like it was nothing," one muttered. "Minutes," said another, shaking his head. They were not just retelling the story. They were rebuilding their own pride through admiration, turning mockery into reverence. For the first time, they looked at age not as weakness, but as the forge of strength. The lesson had been planted, though only time would tell if it would take root. The boy who had apologized sat near him now, stealing glances at the cowboy as though he were a teacher. "Will you show me how?" the boy finally asked, his voice trembling with both fear and hope. The cowboy looked at him, studying the earnestness in his eyes, then gave a small nod. "One day," he said, and in those two words lay a promise. That knowledge, like the land itself, must be passed down to those willing to carry it. As the train roared forward once again, passengers settled into the journey with a new sense of quiet. The sound of wheels on steel no longer felt ordinary. It felt like a hymn, a reminder that even machines depended on the wisdom of human hands. And in the silent figure of the old cowboy, they saw not just the man who had fixed their train, but a reflection of something deeper. The resilience of the Old West itself, scarred but unbroken, mocked yet undefeated, quiet but eternal. The further the train pushed into the frontier, the more the passengers reflected on what they had witnessed. Stories began to circulate within the cars, reshaped with each retelling, but all carrying the same lesson. The old cowboy had done what no one else could. The younger men who once mocked him now spoke of him with reluctant respect, trying to hide their shame by exaggerating the miracle. "He fixed it in less than 5 minutes," one claimed, though everyone knew it had been longer. Their words, though imperfect, marked a shift. Arrogance was being replaced by reverence. The boy who had sought forgiveness lingered close to the cowboy, watching his every move. He studied how the old man's eyes scanned the horizon, how his fingers tapped against the wooden seat in rhythm with the train. To him, these small gestures were not meaningless habits, but secrets, pieces of wisdom hidden in plain sight. The boy longed to learn, to carry forward the knowledge of survival that this man seemed to hold effortlessly. And in the boy's gaze, the cowboy saw something rare, respect born not from legend, but from genuine trust. The women, too, whispered their admiration. He carries himself like a man who's seen too much to be shaken," one said, her eyes fixed on his calm posture. They had witnessed men who bragged loudly in saloons and crumbled in storms. But this cowboy's silence was different. It was not emptiness. It was strength contained, like a river held back by stone. They realized that his years were not a weight, but a weapon, forged by hardships younger men could not endure. The conductor, humbled and quieter than before, found himself drawn into reflection. He had once prided himself on his authority, believing that the train and its steel rails made him the master of the journey. But watching the cowboy work had revealed a deeper truth. Machines may rule the rails, but wisdom rules survival. The conductor began to see his own role differently, not as one of control, but of stewardship, guiding lives with humility rather than pride. And through it all, the cowboy remained unchanged. He did not bask in their admiration, nor did he scorn their earlier insults. He carried himself the same as before, quiet and steady, as if none of it mattered. But in the silence of his presence, every passenger felt something stirring, the realization that they had underestimated the worth of a man whose strength had outlasted years, storms, and scorn. They began to wonder what else he carried in that silence. What lessons still lay hidden behind those weathered eyes? As twilight settled across the plains, the train slowed near a desolate stretch of track with a land stretched wide and unforgiving. Suddenly, a shudder passed through the cars, followed by a jarring halt. Panic rippled through the passengers. Another failure, another delay. Fear returned like an old enemy, voices rising in anxious complaint. Some cursed the railroad, others muttered about being stranded in the middle of nowhere. But one thought passed through every mind at once. What if the cowboy isn't here this time? The conductor rushed out, desperate to assess the damage, while passengers pressed their faces to the windows. The air grew heavy with uncertainty. The young men, who had once been so quick to mock, now sat silent, their bravado gone. Even the boy clutched the wooden seat, his eyes wide with worry. He whispered under his breath, "He'll know what to do." His faith was stronger than the fear that gripped the others, a faith that revealed just how much the cowboy's quiet presence had come to mean. Slowly, the cowboy rose from his seat, his steps measured as he walked toward the stalled engine. The passengers parted like water around him, their earlier scorn now replaced with expectation. He did not rush, did not speak. He simply studied the machine as he had before, his eyes scanning every bolt and line of steel. Where others saw chaos, he saw patterns. Where others felt fear, he felt calm. The silence of the plains lived inside him, and it guided his hands as surely as it had on the trail. Minutes passed, and tension gripped the train like a vice. But then, just as before, the machine roared back to life under his touch, its wheels grinding forward as if nothing had happened. Relief erupted in gasps and whispers, spreading through every car like wildfire. Children clapped, women wept quietly, and men nodded with solemn respect. The old cowboy, once dismissed as useless, had once again proven himself indispensable, not with loud boasts, but with quiet certainty. And this time, the lesson cut even deeper. It was no longer just about a machine fixed in minutes. It was about the truth that wisdom endures where arrogance fails. The passengers realized that without the cowboy, they would have been stranded in the merciless wilderness. And in that moment, they understood fully what they had once mocked. That usefulness is not measured by speed, strength, or youth, but by the quiet resilience of a man who refuses to be broken. The train pressed deeper into the wild, its wheels carrying not only passengers, but also the weight of a lesson none would forget. The silence inside the cars was no longer heavy with shame, but filled with reflection. Men who once boasted loudly now spoke in hushed tones, sharing their admiration for the cowboy. Women watched him with a reverence reserved for rare figures, those who carried wisdom not in their words but in the way they lived. And children leaned close to their parents, whispering that one day they wanted to be strong and steady like the man who had fixed the train twice in minutes. The boy who had once mocked him found courage to sit beside him. For a long moment, he said nothing, fearing his words might fail him. Finally, he whispered, "Sir, how do you know what to do when everyone else is afraid?" The cowboy turned his gaze to the window, the horizon painted in gold by the sinking sun. "Because fear makes men blind," he said quietly. "But if you've lived long enough, you learn to see through it." The boy nodded slowly, as if those words unlocked a truth he would carry for the rest of his life. The younger men listened too, though they pretended not to. Pride still weighed on them, but respect had begun to root itself in their hearts. They realized that they had wasted years chasing noise, seeking to prove themselves with boasts and bravado, while the cowboy had built strength in silence. They began to wonder if their own lives would ever measure up, if they too could learn to carry wisdom without flaunting it. It was a humbling thought, one that stripped away layers of arrogance with each passing mile. The conductor, once the most arrogant of them all, now carried himself differently. He watched the cowboy with quiet reverence, as though every small gesture held meaning. He realized that leadership is not commanding loudly from the front, but standing steady when everyone else falters. He had been given a second chance to see what true authority looked like, and he vowed never to forget it. His role as conductor no longer felt like power. It felt like service, and the cowboy had shown him why. And through it all, the cowboy remained unchanged. He neither sought their admiration nor rejected it. His silence was not pride, nor was it bitterness. It was simply who he was. A man of the Old West, carved by hardship, sharpened by necessity, steady as the horizon itself. And as the train roared forward, the passengers realized they were not just moving across miles of land. They were being carried through a lesson that would follow them long after the journey ended. By the time the train reached its destination, night had fallen and lanterns flickered along the wooden platforms. Passengers stepped off in quiet awe, not rushing as they had at the beginning of the journey. They carried with them more than luggage. They carried a story, a memory, a lesson etched into their hearts. Whispers of the old cowboy spread quickly, passengers telling others of the man who had been mocked as useless, yet fixed the train not once but twice, saving them from despair. His name was not known to them, yet his presence was unforgettable. The boy who had once mocked him lingered by his side, unwilling to leave. With trembling hands, he tugged at the cowboy's sleeve. "I'll remember, sir," he said softly. The cowboy placed a weathered hand on the boy's shoulder, his eyes kind but steady. "Then I reckon my work here is done." No more words were needed. The boy felt the weight of that moment, knowing it would shape him long after childhood had passed. The passengers, one by one, offered nods, glances, and small gestures of gratitude. Some tipped their hats, others offered a handshake, though the cowboy accepted little of it. He needed no thanks, no praise. He had not acted to prove anyone wrong. He had acted because that was what a man of the West did when something was broken. Still, the respect in their eyes was undeniable, and for the first time in years, the cowboy allowed himself to believe that maybe his usefulness had not faded after all. As the train's whistle faded into the night, the old cowboy walked away from the station, his silhouette swallowed by the horizon. Behind him, the passengers carried his story like a flame, retelling it to anyone who would listen. And with each retelling, the laughter that had once mocked him was replaced with reverence. His silence had spoken louder than their words, and his actions had left a mark deeper than their scorn. In the end, the lesson was clear to all who had witnessed it. Never underestimate the quiet strength of a man who has lived, endured, and learned. For sometimes the ones the world calls useless are the very souls who hold the power to set everything back in motion. And in that truth, the legend of the old cowboy was born, not from his words, but from the way he turned silence into strength and scorn into respect. In the end, the story of the old cowboy was never just about a train brought back to life. It was about a man who carried within him the quiet strength of the frontier. Mocked as useless, he revealed that true worth is not measured by youth or speed, but by the wisdom earned through years of hardship. His silence spoke louder than the laughter of the crowd, and his steady hands reminded them that survival depends not on arrogance, but on humility and skill. The passengers walked away changed, their pride stripped bare. They realized that the very man they had dismissed as a relic had carried the power to save them when all else failed. That lesson is not bound to the Old West. It is timeless. How often do we overlook the quiet figures in our own lives, blind to the strength they carry, until the moment their wisdom saves us? The cowboy story forces us to reflect on our own judgments, our own pride, and the way we measure the value of others. The boy's transformation was perhaps the clearest sign of the truth revealed. From mockery to admiration, from arrogance to humility, his voice became the bridge between generations. In his words, "I'll remember, sir," echoed the promise that wisdom, once passed on, never truly dies. It takes root in young hearts, waiting for the day when it, too, will be called upon to set things right. The cowboy's silence had given birth to a legacy far greater than applause. It had planted respect where once there was scorn. The town, the passengers, the conductor, each carried away a story that would be retold at saloons and campfires for years to come. But beyond the legend was the deeper truth. Usefulness is not defined by age, and strength is not always loud. Sometimes, the most powerful men are the ones who do not seek recognition at all. The old cowboy walked away into the horizon, but his lesson remained, etched into the lives of everyone who had seen the train roar back to life under his touch. If this story moved you, share in the comments what part struck your heart the most. And if you believe more people should hear stories like this, tales of redemption, humility, and hidden strength, then don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Each story we tell is a reminder that even in the harshest deserts, wisdom blooms, and that sometimes the quietest soul carries the power to change everything.